The AEC Matador was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to move the immovable. A squat 4x4 of timber and steel, it towed Britain's heavy guns through mud, sand and ruin. In photographs from 1941, they seemed to trundle without haste, yet each was part of an immense rhythm of war, the quiet pull before the thunder. Wherever the Empire fought, the Matador followed. It was neither tank nor truck, but the unheralded hinge that allowed the artillery to strike and withdraw. It was a soldier's constant companion, and the army's answer to distance itself from defeat. A war of engines needed a beast of burden. This one bore its weight without complaint. By 1938, the British Army faced a logistical dilemma. Its artillery was modernizing faster than its mobility. Heavy guns, once pulled by horses, later by clumsy two-wheel drive lorries, were growing heavier, while Europe's roads grew more uncertain. The Army's field tractors, such as the Morris C8 quad, were adequate for light guns, but the new 4.5 and 5.5-inch weapons required a dedicated hauler that could survive the mud of Flanders, the deserts of Libya, and the forests of France. The Associated Equipment Company, better known for London buses, was already experienced in producing robust chassis. When the War Office asked for a medium artillery tractor 4x4, AEC's engineers saw the paradox at once. The vehicle must be compact yet strong, standardized yet versatile, economical yet enduring. The strategic context was bleak. Germany had mechanized its army at speed, fielding half-tracks and prime movers that could relocate batteries within minutes. British planners, watching from the War Office, understood that artillery would once again decide battles, but only if it could move. The First World War had taught that stationary guns were doomed to be overrun or bypassed. In this new conflict, mobility would be defence as much as attack. Factories at Southall were already producing the AEC Regal bus and Mammoth lorry. Both shared a lineage of reliability that made them ideal prototypes for a cross-country tractor. Yet the requirements stretched beyond any civilian design. The new vehicle needed a 4x4 drive system, a high ground clearance, a winch capable of hauling 7 tons, and a payload bed for ammunition or spares. Most of all, it had to carry a crew of 6 and tow a gun weighing several tons, across ground that barely qualified as road. Britain's strategic reserves of mechanization were limited. Petrol engines strained under load, and diesel technology was still maturing for military use. The engineers at AEC proposed a 7.6-litre inline-6 diesel, dependable, torquey, slow revving. It would move weight through patience, not speed. That idea, endurance over urgency, defined the Matador's character. In the winter of 1938 to 1939, trials at the mechanization experimental establishment exposed the flaws of earlier tractors. Axles broke, tires shredded, clutches overheated. It was not enough to design for power. The vehicle had to survive its own work. Every hour in the field revealed new stresses. The artillery regiments wanted a machine that would not merely reach the gun sight, but return from it. Civilians at home knew nothing of these debates, yet they would feel their consequence. Britain's industry would need to shift from passenger to military output within months. The bus makers of London would soon be making gun haulers. Carpenters would fashion cabs instead of carriages. The Matador emerged from this tension between comfort and necessity, a bus builder's answer to war. The first production prototypes appeared in early 1939. Angular, upright, fitted with the signature split windscreen and roof hatch. The cabin was part timber, part steel. The rear bed was wooden planking bolted to a ladder frame. It looked simple, but every line was deliberate. The boxy front allowed easy repair, the high wheel arches cleared deep ruts, and the wide cab windows gave drivers rare visibility. When war was declared that September, AEC had produced fewer than a dozen examples. By Dunkirk, Britain had lost most of its artillery tractors to the Channel. The evacuation exposed the shortage brutally. Guns had been abandoned, not for lack of ammunition, but for lack of traction. Commanders demanded a rapid expansion of heavy tractor production. Within months, the Matador's design was frozen and orders multiplied. Its very name, Matador, hinted at controlled strength, the disciplined bullfighter, not the bull. For the gunners who would rely on it, that name carried a quiet promise. They would have a vehicle capable of facing the battlefield's chaos with calm precision. In these months of improvisation, when everything seemed to be in deficit, armour, fuel, confidence, the AEC Matador represented an act of foresight. It was Britain's bet that the coming war would be one of movement, not entrenchment. And to move its guns, the army would need a workhorse built not for speed, but for certainty. The need had been defined, a truck that could conquer mud, bear weight, and endure time. The Matador would soon prove that it could do all three. At Southall, in the industrial west of London, the drawing boards were already crowded with ambition. AEC's engineers, accustomed to shaping the capital's red buses, found themselves redesigning the logic of motion for war. A blueprint began to form, a 4x4 tractor that would merge commercial efficiency with military resilience. Their task was not to invent beauty, but to distill reliability. The vision owed nothing to vanity. AEC's technical staff worked from one governing principle: the gun must arrive regardless of terrain. The Matador's designers, men like Chief Engineer G.J. Rackham, translated that maxim into geometry. They replaced ornament with purpose, substituting comfort for function. The frame was a ladder of riveted steel, the cab, ash and sheet metal, the drivetrain, a deliberate marriage of power and restraint. Every component answered the single doctrine of endurance. The Army's Directorate of Mechanization delivered specifications with the bluntness of necessity: ground clearance, at least 13 inches, towing capacity, 5.5 tons, winch strength, 7 tons, engine torque, sufficient to climb gradients that would humble a lorry. These were not ambitions, but requirements, each verified by trial rather than optimism. The AEC Matador was designed as a bridge between two doctrines: the static artillery of the First World War and the mobile warfare that now defined Europe. Inside the Southall workshops, the war still seemed distant. There were no uniforms, no air raid sirens, only the rasp of files and the measured beat of hammers on test chassis. The engineers worked beneath lamps that burned late into the night, tracing lines of force and weight. Blueprints were corrected, redrawn, approved, and archived, the visual language of a nation preparing itself through paper. What emerged from those boards was a paradox, a vehicle of heavy purpose, built by a company renowned for public comfort. AEC's buses carried Londoners safely across the city. Its lorries supplied merchants and builders. Now, those same production lines would yield an artillery tractor whose first cargo was the weapon of defeat itself. Yet the design lineage remained visible. The curved roof of the Matador's cab owed its ancestry to the Regent bus, while its engine drew from commercial practice refined through decades of service. AEC was not learning warcraft. It was translating peacetime engineering into martial endurance. In these early months, the War Office planners argued over priorities. Some favoured speed, believing manoeuvre would win the coming battles, while others insisted that strength and persistence would prove decisive. The AEC team, quietly practical, built for both. They saw that a gun unplaced was as useless as a gun unfired. The Matador would guarantee position. That was its silent promise. To those inside the design office, every line on the drafting table was a reply to the terrain ahead. Mud meant torque, sand meant cooling, mountains meant braking. The designers spoke of the machine as if it were a soldier, dependable, modest, and responsive. Even the cabin windows were conceived as tactical devices, providing wide arcs of visibility for navigation under blackout conditions. By late 1939, as the first prototypes were tested, a sense of quiet conviction had settled over Southall. The engineers believed they had solved the central equation of artillery mobility. A vehicle that could tow a gun across open country unassisted, with crew and ammunition aboard, was no longer theory. It was waiting on the test field. Yet the Matador was more than a machine. It represented a shift in British thinking, an acknowledgement that wars of the 20th century would be won by logistics, not merely by courage. Every bolt, every panel, every gallon of fuel carried that philosophy. AEC's draftsmen, peering through cigarette haze at their meticulous blueprints, could not have known how many lives their lines would preserve. But they sensed the weight of what they were making. In the age of mechanized artillery, vision itself was a form of defense. War production was a study in discipline. Inside AEC's Southall works, the rhythm of manufacture replaced the language of design. The engineers had imagined the Matador. Now the fitters, welders, and machinists had to make it real. The great factory sheds, once humming with civilian orders, became a landscape of purposeful repetition. Steel sections arriving at dawn, rivets clattering by midday, frames advancing through their assembly lines like pilgrims toward completion. The first series vehicles bore the signature of urgency. Their wooden cabs were cut by hand, their engines lowered into place by chain hoists swung from overhead beams. Each chassis moved forward by inches, gathering its identity piece by piece. Differential, transfer case, winch drum, cab shell, and finally the tall, heavy tires that made its stance so distinctive. There was nothing elegant about the process. It was a kind of industrial ritual, repeated until it resembled inevitability. The Associated Equipment Company had long prided itself on craftsmanship, and that culture persisted even under the strain of wartime demand. Supervisors walked the aisles with notebooks, checking tolerances that might mean the difference between success and ruin in the field. A misaligned prop shaft could strand an entire battery. Every mechanic understood the consequence of haste, yet the nation's need permitted no delay. The paradox was constant: build faster, but make no mistakes. Raw materials arrived from every corner of Britain: steel from Wales, timber from Scotland, rubber from colonial reserves. The smell of oil and sawdust mingled with the scent of tea from canteens, where men and women shared hurried breaks between shifts. The workforce had expanded beyond expectation. By 1941, women occupied key roles on the assembly floor, operating lathes and presses with a precision born of concentration, not training. The 7.6-litre AEC diesel was the heart of the enterprise. Crated engines arrived from subsidiary plants, each tested on dynamometers before fitting. When first turned over, they issued a low, deliberate thrum, the sound of mechanical patience. To the men who heard it, the note meant readiness. The vehicle could now move under its own power, if only for a few yards. Mechanics called that first movement the awakening. Painting and inspection followed. The Matador left the line in a coat of deep bronze green, wheels blackened, windows sealed against the dust of transit. Before shipment, inspectors crawled beneath the chassis with lamps, tapping at rivets, checking torque settings, ensuring that nothing had been left to chance. A single oversight might strand a gun crew in the desert. By the middle of 1941, the Southall plant was turning out hundreds each month. The factory gates were rarely silent. Completed Matadors rolled out beneath the gaslight, bound for depots across Britain. Some went to artillery training schools, others directly to embarkation ports. It was an unending procession of square silhouettes, proof that Britain, though bombed and weary, still possessed the means to build. To an observer, the process seemed mechanical, but there was a quiet artistry in it. Each cab, though nominally identical, bore subtle variations. A carpenter's hand here, a fitter's adjustment there. Wartime standardization could never erase human touch. Within every vehicle lay the marks of those who had built it, anonymous yet enduring. By late 1941, AEC was joined by other manufacturers, Leyland and Crossley among them, to expand output. The Matador design was robust enough to be shared, its blueprints copied and distributed under government supervision. With production dispersed, the risk of disruption by bombing lessened. What had begun as a single company's vision became a national undertaking. Beyond the factory walls, the war's tempo increased. North Africa demanded vehicles that could operate in extremes: blistering heat, corrosive sand, endless vibration. The Matador's assembly line reflected that urgency. Additional air filters, strengthened suspension springs, and desert cooling modifications were incorporated into later batches. Each adaptation was recorded in penciled notes on battered clipboards, small annotations to history. No ceremony marked the completion of each vehicle. The workers did not know where their Matadors would serve, only that they were needed immediately. Some were to haul 5.5-inch guns across the dunes, others to tow 3.7-inch anti-aircraft pieces into the hills above Tobruk. Every vehicle represented a silent alliance between those who built and those who fought. In time, the process itself became invisible, absorbed into the wider rhythm of wartime Britain. To the public, the Matador was just another piece of equipment. To the men at Southall, it was something else, proof that craft and conscience could still coexist amid destruction. They built thousands, and in each the line between necessity and pride was almost indistinguishable. When the last quality checks were complete and the final signature scrawled across the inspection sheet, the Matador was driven from the factory yard. Its diesel note echoed against the brick walls, fading into the night. Another would follow within minutes. The production line had no pause, only purpose. Testing began in the long, wet spring of 1940, a year when Britain's fate hung in balance and every invention was measured against survival. The AEC Matador faced its first trials at the Mechanization Experimental Establishment, Farnborough. There, in a churn of mud and calculation, its worth was proven not by proclamation, but by endurance. Observers from the Royal Artillery stood beside the engineers, their field notebooks spattered with rain. They watched as the vehicle reversed under the weight of a 5.5-inch gun, its tires biting deep into the test ground. Engines were measured by torque, winches by load, men by patience. A driver engaged the low-ratio gears and eased forward. The convoy moved, slowly but without falter. The machine had passed its first judgment. It could pull what it was made to pull. Further trials followed on the chalk ridges of southern England, on the gravel tracks of Yorkshire, and later on the rough lanes of Scotland. The army wanted proof that no terrain could humble the design. The Matador met each challenge with the same steady composure, an absence of drama that was its own kind of virtue. Even with a full artillery crew and load, it rarely bogged down. When it did, its rear-mounted winch hauled both itself and the gun clear, a demonstration of self-reliance that earned it quiet respect. By 1941, confidence had replaced uncertainty. Reports from the testing grounds praised the Matador's torque, its stability, and above all, its reliability. Mechanics noted that it could run hundreds of miles without serious fault. The diesel engine, though underpowered by civilian standards, was admired for its calm persistence. Soldiers began to speak of the vehicle with the understated affection reserved for things that worked. Then came the desert. North Africa, vast and indifferent, became the proving ground of everything Britain had built. Matadors were shipped to Egypt in their hundreds, disembarking at Alexandria and Port Said. Their green paint was quickly dulled by sand, their engines fitted with twin air filters to withstand the dust. In the heat, even metal seemed to tire, but the AEC design endured. Photographs from the 8th Army show long convoys of Matadors dragging guns across dunes, their drivers squinting into the glare. They towed 4.5-inch field guns and 5.5-inch medium pieces to positions that horses could never have reached. When the guns fired, the Matadors waited, engines idling, hatches open, until the battery was ordered to move again. In those endless desert campaigns, movement was survival. Field reports from the Royal Artillery describe the vehicle's temperament as steady, deliberate, uncomplaining. Crews valued its winch most of all. In soft sand, a gun could sink within minutes. A Matador could pull it free in half that time. Drivers learned to trust the long clutch pedal, to feel for the point where power met traction. Many recalled that once they had mastered its peculiar patience, the machine would carry them anywhere. The real test, however, was not terrain, but endurance. In desert heat, oil thinned and seals perished. Mechanics carried spare hoses and improvised gaskets from canvas and soap. The Matador tolerated it all. It might lose speed, but rarely heart. The 4x4 system, derived from AEC's lorry experience, proved resilient even under sustained strain. During one trial in Tunisia, a Matador reportedly towed a broken-down tank over a ridge simply because there was no other vehicle nearby. The feat was recorded in passing, as if unremarkable. Yet such moments defined its legend. It was the vehicle that made artillery mobile and, by extension, made retreat unnecessary. Back in Britain, the mechanization establishment continued to refine its specifications. Lessons from Africa were incorporated into later marks: improved cooling, reinforced axles, better cab ventilation. Each adjustment made the machine less temperamental and more universal. When tested again under European conditions, the Matador was found equally capable on muddy lanes and cobbled roads. Its purpose had become global, a machine without climate. The final measure of any weapon or tool in war is whether it fulfills its promise. The Matador did so without spectacle. It was neither glamorous nor feared. It simply worked. In that steady obedience lay its genius. By the end of 1942, the War Office declared the AEC Matador fully proven. The tests were over. The real trials were about to begin, not in fields of England, but in the fields of battle. In 1942, the British Army's artillery began to move as never before. Across North Africa, the desert itself became a theatre of manoeuvre, and the AEC Matador its unheralded actor. Every victory that required medium guns to advance owed something to those 4x4 tractors grumbling across the sand. At El Alamein, hundreds of Matadors formed a slow-moving tide behind the lines, drawing the firepower of an entire corps into position. When the barrage opened, the desert shook. The guns could fire because the Matadors had delivered them. For many soldiers, that campaign was the machine's true debut. Commanders noted that batteries once fixed to a single sector could now shift 20 miles overnight. The vehicle had turned artillery from a static arm into a fluid one. "Mobility," wrote one war correspondent, "is our new artillery doctrine." The Matador was at the heart of that transformation. It was not without setbacks. In the early phases, spare parts were scarce. Tires wore faster than replacements could arrive, and crews improvised with wire and rope. Yet the failures were of logistics, not design. Even half repaired, the Matador kept working. When a gun was abandoned, it was never because its tractor refused to pull. Mechanics spoke of the AEC as a machine that forgave. After North Africa came Sicily and Italy, campaigns of hills and mud, where every climb tested its 7.6-litre engine. In photographs from 1943, one can see the strain etched in the ground itself, deep twin ruts leading toward the gun line. The diesel groaned at altitude, but the load always moved. That patience, that refusal to surrender momentum, became a kind of faith among gunners. Then, in 1944, came Normandy. The invasion required an army not just to land, but to advance through a labyrinth of bocage and village lanes. Here the Matador achieved its quiet triumph. It could thread where larger trucks balked, and its four-wheel drive made light of the flooded verges. In Caen, columns of Matadors towed the 5.5-inch guns through rubble and across improvised bridges. A single photograph, a convoy passing the ruins of the city, captures the paradox of progress, devastation hauled forward by determination. Artillery commanders in France measured success not in destroyed targets, but in miles advanced per day. Their reports read like testaments to motion. Guns repositioned by first light. Battery relocated under fire. Each line concealed the same agent, a Matador in low gear, dragging its charge through rain and wreckage. The vehicle's design philosophy proved itself in this theatre more than any. Its simplicity meant it could be repaired with basic tools. Its diesel efficiency doubled range compared to petrol lorries. Where other machines demanded constant nursing, the Matador asked only for fuel and faith. It became, in the words of one sergeant, the best friend of a tired gun. Yet even success carried a price. The relentless use wore down engines and transmissions. Overworked winches snapped cables. Dust and debris seeped into every bearing. Maintenance crews worked through the night, coaxing life back into exhausted machines. Still, the Matadors rolled out again each morning. They had become part of the Army's metabolism, unseen yet vital. By 1945, the type had hauled guns across 3 continents. It had crossed rivers on makeshift pontoons, dragged supplies through snow in the Ardennes, and carried prisoners of war back from captured camps. Wherever the British Army moved, its artillery followed, and wherever the artillery went, a Matador led the way. In the measured language of official reports, it was recorded as satisfactory in all respects. But among those who drove it, the verdict was simpler. It never failed them. In a war defined by machines of aggression, the Matador's triumph was defensive, a servant of endurance, not destruction. When victory finally came, the battered tractors stood in lines at roadside halts, mud-streaked, silent, their work finished. They had carried the weight of Britain's artillery from retreat to return. In that journey lay their quiet breakthrough, the transformation of an army's reach, achieved without applause. War ends publicly, but its machinery continues in silence. For the AEC Matador, victory was not an end, but a dispersal. When the guns ceased, the trucks remained, thousands of them, serviceable, unspent, their purpose suddenly uncertain. Britain, exhausted and indebted, could not afford waste. The Matadors were demobilized as methodically as they had once been built, driven to depots and parks where rows of them stretched to the horizon like dormant regiments. The hidden consequence of their success was abundance. Too reliable to scrap and too specialized for civilian trade, the Matador became a paradox of peace, a machine without a war. The Ministry of Supply listed them as surplus assets, but for many they represented opportunity. Hauliers, foresters and showmen acquired them by the hundred, converting gun tractors into lorries, recovery vehicles and fairground haulers. Their rugged simplicity made them adaptable, their endurance legendary. For the engineers who had created them, there was a strange melancholy in seeing their work repurposed. The precise balance of gearing and traction, the reinforced frame built to tow artillery, now pulled timber from British forests or circuses from town to town. A machine designed to sustain the Empire's armies now sustained its peacetime trades. The same strength that had conquered mud and sand found new meaning on rural lanes. But there was another, quieter consequence, an industrial one. The Matador had taught Britain's engineers that utility and durability could coexist. The wartime collaboration between AEC, Leyland and Crossley had laid the groundwork for post-war standardization. Lorry production would never again be purely civilian. Military-grade durability became an expectation. The war had turned ordinary transport into a science of reliability. Within the British Army, however, the Matador's very longevity posed a problem. Newer designs, the Leyland Martian and the AEC Militant, awaited introduction, but older vehicles refused to die. Through the late 1940s, Matadors still served in artillery regiments, refitted with canvas tops and reconditioned engines. In Hong Kong, Palestine and Malaya, they towed guns through conflicts that officially did not count as wars. Economically, their persistence revealed an irony. The more successful the design, the slower the industry moved. AEC, having built the perfect wartime tractor, now had to invent reasons to replace it. The Matador's afterlife proved that reliability, though prized in war, could hinder progress in peace. In government reports, such facts were presented as logistics. In truth, they were about people. The drivers who had trusted the Matador in France or Egypt often bought their own surplus vehicles, converting them for business. They found comfort in its familiar rattle, its unhurried power. Many small post-war haulage firms were born from those ex-service machines. A vehicle that once symbolized Britain's martial reach now underpinned its economic recovery. There were moral echoes too. The Matador had been a weapons servant, built to carry destruction. Now it hauled timber, stone and fairground rides. It became a fixture of British life, its military past half forgotten. Children climbed into its cab at fêtes without knowing that the same seat had once faced artillery fire. The transformation was quiet but profound, an illustration of how tools of war are absorbed by the living. By the 1950s, most Matadors had faded into civilian anonymity, their khaki repainted in company colours, their military fittings removed. Yet the frame, the diesel heart, the steady gait, these remained. The sound of that slow, confident engine became part of Britain's post-war countryside, a ghost of war disguised as industry. In the end, the hidden consequence of the AEC Matador was continuity. It blurred the boundary between wartime necessity and peacetime endurance, proving that design made for conflict could sustain peace if built with integrity. Few machines carry such contradictions with grace. In the years that followed, the AEC Matador passed quietly into legend. Few spoke its name, yet thousands recognized its form: the high cab, the blunt bonnet, the broad-shouldered stance that seemed built to carry Britain itself. The war was over, but its outline remained visible in the byways and hedgerows of the nation it had served. Many found second lives in civilian hands. Timber merchants prized their torque. Construction firms valued their sure-footedness on unmade roads. Some became recovery vehicles, others mobile cranes. At fairs and transport rallies, they appeared resplendent in bright paint, their artillery hitches replaced by towing bars for caravans and rides. The same mechanical patience that had once towed guns now hauled livelihoods. Museums began to preserve a few examples. The Imperial War Museum's collection at Duxford holds a pristine specimen, its khaki restored, its winch cables still wound tight. Visitors stand before it in silence, sensing the scale of work it performed. Unlike tanks or aircraft, the Matador evokes no glamour, only a kind of calm respect. It represents the invisible half of warfare. the part that moves, supports, sustains. Technically, its influence reached far beyond 1945. The post-war AEC militant, a heavier six-wheel descendant, carried forward its engineering philosophy: torque over speed, balance over excess. Even civilian haulage adopted its lessons: high-mounted driving positions, standardized powertrains, and service accessibility designed for field repair. The Matador had taught Britain that reliability could be industrialized. In other nations, too, echoes of its design persisted. Dutch, Belgian, and Polish forces operated surplus Matadors well into the 1950s, some refitted with locally built bodies. A handful even served in colonial campaigns, their olive paint dulled by tropical light. Wherever they went, they embodied the same principle: that logistics, not firepower alone, wins wars. Collectors of military vehicles speak of the Matador with quiet admiration. It lacks the theatrical menace of a tank, but those who restore one often describe the process as an act of tribute. Beneath layers of rust, they find craftsmanship unspoiled by haste. The timber joints still fit, the bolts still thread cleanly after decades. Each restoration becomes a conversation with the past, a rediscovery of British engineering's most modest triumph. At commemorations, when veterans gather beside their old machines, the Matador often stands in the background, its engine ticking softly. It does not dominate, yet it belongs. For the gunners of the Royal Artillery, its silhouette is part of memory. The dependable shape that appeared in every dawn convoy, its headlights half-masked, its driver alert but unhurried. They remember the way it climbed when all else bogged down, the way it answered every call to move. In cultural memory, the Matador endures as the unsung link between men and their weapons, between command and execution. It symbolizes the principle that victory depends as much on movement as on courage. Its endurance proved that the mundane could be heroic, that the act of towing a gun through mud might matter as much as firing it. The legacy of the AEC Matador is thus not confined to museums or rallies. It lives in the philosophy of modern engineering. Every dependable military truck, every logistic vehicle that prizes function over display, owes a silent debt to that wartime design. The lesson remains the same: build it strong, keep it simple, and it will outlast the purpose for which it was made. By the turn of the century, few working examples remained, yet the affection persisted. Enthusiasts drove them in remembrance parades, their engines still emitting that familiar low rumble, the sound of a nation's endurance in mechanical form, and so the Matador survives, not as relic, but as reminder. Strength without arrogance, service without vanity, these were its gifts. Time eventually dissolves even the most durable of steel. The AEC Matador, once an emblem of utility, now lingers only in museums, photographs, and the memory of its sound. A slow diesel throb, a patient grind of gears, the deep exhalation of air brakes before rest, the language of endurance. Its story is not one of battle, but of persistence. It never fired, yet it helped every gun that did. Its victories were measured in miles, in shells delivered, in men spared the labour of dragging artillery by hand, and for that reason it occupies a special place among Britain's machines of war, not as a weapon, but as the quiet geometry that made weapons possible. The Matador was, in essence, a promise kept. It had been built to move weight across impossible ground, and it did. In its strength there was restraint, in its labour, dignity. It never glorified war. It endured it, carrying its burden without complaint. Look again at the photographs. One in Normandy, a convoy inching past the shattered ruins of Caen. Another in Libya, a gun hauled across an empty plain. Another, decades later, a veteran machine gleaming in preservation. They belong to different worlds, yet each bears the same unspoken thought, that progress, whether in war or peace, depends on the faithful unseen. The AEC Matador belongs to that lineage of necessary things, inventions that did not astonish, but endured. Engineers designed it to pull. History made it a symbol of steadiness. In its measured hum resided the rhythm of a nation determined to move forward, one slow revolution at a time. Now, as it rests behind museum ropes, its paint pristine and its tires still marked by decades of service, one can almost hear the echo of its purpose. The world it served has vanished, but the principle remains. Strength is not noise. Progress is not haste. The men who built it, the soldiers who trusted it, and the generations who restored it share that single inheritance, that the true measure of a machine lies not in what it destroys, but in what it carries. The AEC Matador carried Britain's weight through war and left it lighter in spirit. Its wheels no longer turn, yet its motion continues, in the quiet certainty that endurance once achieved never truly stops.